if you look at the election process now, as painful as it is to look at it,
It's very painful. We're just a few weeks away from the election, with Trump being supposedly catching up with Hillary Clinton.
you find that Trump and his people putting forth a narrative that all is incompetent and America is collapsing, and it's because of the incompetence and the misbehavior or the desire to make America collapse on the part of President Obama and all of the officials who work with him, including Hillary Clinton. And you must elect Donald Trump in order to reverse the narrative and, quotes, make America great again. And if I can say something about the Trump phenomenon,
Please.
to a degree, it's cultic. That is, there are many things that go into it. There are many ways of looking at him, including his narcissism and a kind of totalism. But without going into all of them, when you watch him at his rallies, he's like a kind of guru who's shouting out truths and getting religious-like responses from the group. Lock her up, kill her even. It's also got a violent quality that he's calling forth. And with the guru, it isn't so much a thought process, it's a profound feeling that the guru is providing a path for everyone's immortality. And only by following him can you have this eternal and pure existence.
Right.
And you feel that, at least in the hardcore of Trump followers. I'm hopeful. I think that there's still enough intelligence in the general American electorate to reject that narrative in general and to prevent his being elected president.
But being of Jewish background, I know you are too, being educated about the Holocaust, all of that we've been through, to even have somebody reach a level of running for president of the United States of America with these qualities that
Yes, it's
are
very
so reminiscent of an Adolf Hitler or a Mussolini or other totalitarian dictators is so upsetting.
Yes, and you don't have to be Jewish to be upset by this.
Right, but I mean, for me personally,
Yes, of course,
that's
of
part
course.
of why I've been so public for 40 years after my own cult experience, was like, they did this to me.
Yeah. Yes, and I understand that, and he and his children, especially Donald Trump Jr., kind of flirt with neo-Nazi websites. They're interested in them, and they sometimes put them put aspects of them on the internet. There's a tendency, there's an attraction to them on his part and the part of his family. That's why repeatedly we've seen neo-Nazi images in things that he's brought, he's tweeted or somehow made visible, and the same has been true of his children. And that is concerning when this moves from the fringes to the center of American political life.
Especially with all the media that he's garnering. I've written several blogs about Trump's narcissism and sociopathology. And recently his son Eric went to opening of a Moon Tommy gun warehouse.
Really?
My former cult leader has a son who owns a gun factory.
I see.
And so there's a direct connection now with Trump and the Moonies, which
Really?
is
I
very,
didn't know that. Yeah.
very upsetting. But I guess let's come back to the beginning, where you wanted to talk about global climate change, which for me is it's so infuriating that Trump still seems to be denying
Yeah.
that too.
I wrote a piece together with my partner, Nancy Rosenblum, called Climate and the Candidates on this. and
Has it been published?
yes, it's
No.
been
I
published
have to
on
look it up.
on the Huffington Post.
Okay.
But you know, Trump says that climate change is a hoax, and probably a Chinese hoax, because they want to somehow weaken America. And of course, Trump, along with somewhat like-minded people, usually from the right wing in different parts of the world, but his being a central kind of version of it because he's an American, and American leaders are so significant in the world. They could, in a way, block the possibility of our stemming climate change and global warming. I see global warming as being the ultimate human absurdity, because if we do nothing, just go on doing what we're doing, not change anything, we run the risk of destroying ourselves as a species. Certainly as a civilization within some decades or within this century, and ultimately destroying ourselves virtually completely by doing nothing. With nuclear weapons, we have that possibility also, of course, as I said, but we have to make these objects. We have to then make the structural arrangements to use them and drop them on other human beings and start a nuclear winter that might really end all life on Earth. We have to do all those things for it to happen. With climate, we don't have to do anything. We just have to do as we're doing, which means using fossil fuels to the extent that we are using them, and that would happen. But there's hope in this area too, and in a way, I wrote another piece, which I also published in the Huffington Post, about Paris and what that entailed, the meetings last December.
About global climate.
That's right,
Policy.
about global warming. This is probably the first time in human history that human beings really throughout the earth got together, all representatives of every single country that qualifies as a country came to Paris and joined in those accords which recognized climate change as a danger to the species. So although it didn't alter the danger because it didn't include legal legal responsibility for carrying through all of the reduction in fossil fuels that's necessary, it's still recognized on a global level.
Right.
What I came to call, I've come to call this species awareness. Species awareness about global warming or climate change, and we've developed some such species awareness about nuclear danger as well. And that species awareness doesn't guarantee our future, but it makes possible the actions necessary to sustain a hopeful human future.
Right.
And then there have been two agreements between America and China, one prior to Paris and one in the last few weeks, both about climate change, so that the two greatest polluters of the past, present, and potential future can come together on this issue when they have so many differences otherwise. And that also is hopeful because that sets a standard for the world in general.
I believe President Obama just met with the head of China.
That's when they came to this.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
when
fantastic.
they came to this agreement. So that's what I'm preoccupied with, and really in my studies from the beginning, once I became involved in Chinese thought reform, saw what people were doing to try to control other people's minds, it seemed clear to me that not just the Chinese, but any organized group could embark on this kind of enterprise. And to take specific examples like this and see them as universal has been very much at the heart of my work. It isn't that one just transfers them to the universal. One has to look at them through their own cultural lens,
Right.
what that particular culture was doing in its own terms, in order to recognize what a universal version would be.
Right.
And that's why it was interesting when young people coming out of fanatical American cults would cite my chapter on
Chapter 22,
Yeah,
Ideological Totalism.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many times I've read it or read it to my clients who I was helping to get out of groups.
chapter 22. It was
The
a
8 criteria that I base my bite model on.
It was a surprise. No, it was a surprise to hear about it. But once I thought about it, it was not surprising that these same patterns of totalism would exist in these cults as they did among Chinese communists. And by having that universalistic perspective, I think it's connected these various destructive events that I've studied. And although they're very different, each is a different problem, they connect in their destructiveness, in they're representing a universal problem. And then in my sense, as I articulate in the idea of open personal change or the idea of the protean self, in my sense that human beings are capable of change and capable not of becoming pure and ideal creatures, but of bungling through, at least, and carrying through our capacity to survive.
Right. And I guess I want to just comment, this is your memoir, Witness to an Extreme Century. Highly recommend. If you're going to read one, read this and then go back after you get your senses tantalized. I've been studying ISIS the last couple of years and extremist groups like them, and they have taken all of what we've learned about social psychology, social influence techniques, use of hypnosis, and brought it on the internet. And they're recruiting and remote control programming people to do acts of violence.
Well, ISIS is a totalistic and murderous group. It's also an apocalyptic group.
Exactly.
That one has to keep in mind, so that there is the vision on the part of ISIS leaders of not only becoming leaders in the Islamic world, but creating a caliphate, which would be at the center of world control. And then there would be the destruction of the world.
Of all the infidels who don't
Of all the infidels, and the caliphate is the preparation for that destruction on the part of God, in a way similar to the Christian or Judeo-Christian apocalyptic vision, and that of some evangelicals of getting right with Jesus prior to the apocalyptic moment of God destroying the world, and then recreating it in this purer, more virtuous form. That apocalyptic quality gives it enormous power and attractiveness, though it's also true that many of the people recruited probably have little idea about this theology and are drawn because they see themselves as becoming part of something exciting and virtuous. They consider now, as Islamic youth, becoming strong and respected and powerful in a way they haven't been in their dislocated lives in Western countries, whether it's European countries, as is usually the case, or England, or the United States. And in that sense, it can be a very appealing kind of message that's put forward. And the internet is, of course, a newly effective medium
Right.
for reaching people.
Right, they're using Westerners that they recruited
Yeah.
to create forms that will attract and connect to the youth in America and in the Western countries. They're drawing on books like Lord of the Rings or the Matrix movie or video games, and they're activating people's selves that were connected imaginatively in those alternate
So you can
worlds.
see from what you say and what we're observing how a certain degree of high intelligence, which they do reflect,
Yes.
and capacity to use technologies effectively, how that can combine with fierce and deadly extremism. To us, the deadly extremism doesn't seem very logical and doesn't seem to be the kind of position that should be embraced by highly intelligent people.
Right.
But it can be and is.
Right, happened to me. But what's happening now virtually, you don't need to get someone to a physically isolated location. People can be isolated in their apartment, online, 8-10 hours a day, watching videos, doing discussion boards.
Yeah, yeah.
And it gets inside people's heads and becomes that cult identity.
It gets inside their heads partly because they feel dislocated and not at home and often discriminated against in the countries where they live.
Not always. At least the fellow from Massachusetts whose father was a physician who became one of the architects of the social media network and went to Catholic high school, highly successful, great student and everything. I think he was just deceptively recruited and incrementally...
Well, but
I don't
that can exist, and yet, in other words, he can be highly successful and he can be, somebody who seems to be making a good life
Right.
in a Western country, in this case the United States, but he still can feel a little bit alienated from his own tradition.
That's true.
He
That's
can
true.
feel alienated from his own tradition and lacking a full expression of his Islamic nature, of his, if he's Syrian or Saudi or whatever he happens to be, of that tradition, and that pull can be very strong.
Yes.
You know, Hitler said, or Hitler's followers said, "You make us proud to feel German again." Meaning he enabled them to feel or re-experience their own ethnic background, their Germanness, which they had felt in some way alienated from, even living in their own country. And here are a number of Islamics, especially young Islamics, living in Western countries throughout the world, and they can feel the pull of that Islamic tradition, which is put forward in newly powerful ways
Yes.
by ISIS. And that has a deep attraction, even if they seem to be successful
Right.
externally in the country where they're living.
Right, and I watched a Frontline that focused on an American who had been recruited into Al Qaeda, I believe, and his father was Muslim and mother was Protestant. Grew up here, top student, top athlete, etc. And when he was in 8th grade, went to visit his family. I'm forgetting where, if it was Syria or Pakistan. And it was that side of the family was like, well, let us show us what the tradition of your father. And he stayed there for a couple of weeks, and he said in his own journal, when I came back, I was never the same. It was like a part of me was...
Yes, that's an exact example of what I'm talking about. And it's a tough kind of attraction to interrupt and to intervene against. But I also think there can be, I mean, force has to be used, there's no doubt about it, because they derive much of their power from having territory
Yes.
and a standing army.
Yep.
One could say that the ISIS is more of a fanatical standing army with a religious vision, as opposed to Om Shinrikyo, which was a religious vision which converted itself into an apocalyptic army. But in any case, some of the cruelty of ISIS is being recognized, and there are defectors.
Oh, many.
Who are perhaps increasing in
Yes.
numbers
Yes.
as the truth becomes known. And that, along with ISIS being denied some of its territory and some of its victories on the battlefield, can change that process. But it's an ugly one and a painful one along the way.
I think the survivors, the ex-members of ISIS, if they understood mind control and thought reform and cults, and they could be much more effective than just trying to argue the Quran and that that ISIS has a wrong interpretation of the Quran.
If you remember, there was a similar effort with American cults. There were a number of religious people or ministers who came and to try to convince cult members or former cult members that this wasn't the true Christianity.
Yeah, and it didn't work very well, unfortunately.
Well, where there was some, I heard of some case, who's to say, but I heard of some cases in which they're exposing this kind of murderous version of Christianity, at least made an inroad for people who saw themselves as religious Christians.
Yeah, if they grew up Christian
If they grew up
before
in that
they were
way,
in the
yeah.
cult. Absolutely. How are you doing energy-wise? Do we need a break?
We can take a little break.
Yeah.
I